The Riverside Police Department falls into stunned silence as federal agents execute arrest warrants, while FBI Director Victoria Hayes personally places handcuffs on Detective Paul Brennan in front of his shocked colleagues and superiors. Brennan's confident smirk vanishes as he recognizes the woman he dismissed as just another federal bureaucrat asking too many questions during yesterday's case review meeting. The same woman he'd told to stick to federal matters and let local police handle local crimes. Detective Paul Brennan, Director Hayes announces, her voice carrying unmistakable federal authority throughout the packed police station. You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact to murder. Some of you may not recognize me from yesterday's meeting where I was investigating the Marcus Washington hate crime that you systematically covered up. Her eyes lock onto Brennan, who has gone pale. Detective Brennan, I believe we need to discuss why you falsified evidence, intimidated witnesses, and told federal investigators that the Washington murder was just gang violence, not some racial conspiracy that the FBI needs to worry about. The gathered officers freeze in recognition. The detective who 24 hours ago had obstructed a federal hate crime investigation now faces the FBI director, whose personal intervention will expose his entire criminal conspiracy, and federal charges carry mandatory life sentences. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 72 hours earlier, FBI Director Victoria Hayes had been reviewing civil rights violation reports at the federal building when she received intelligence about a potential hate crime cover-up that would require the most sensitive federal intervention of her 19-year law enforcement career. At 51, Hayes had built her reputation on dismantling police corruption and institutional racism through innovative federal prosecution techniques that exposed systematic civil rights violations while protecting community members from retaliation and witness intimidation. Her appointment as FBI director had been recognition of her exceptional ability to navigate complex federal-local jurisdictional issues while ensuring that civil rights enforcement served community safety rather than creating additional trauma for victims of institutional abuse and discrimination. The Marcus Washington case had emerged from FBI monitoring of hate crime patterns in mid-sized cities, where local law enforcement often lacked resources or political will to investigate racially motivated violence that threatened community stability and constitutional protections. Marcus Washington, a 23-year-old college graduate and community volunteer, had been found dead in Riverside City's East Side neighborhood under circumstances that strongly suggested racially motivated murder rather than random criminal violence or gang activity. Initial evidence indicated that Washington had been targeted by white supremacist group members who had been escalating harassment and threats against successful black professionals and community leaders throughout Riverside's integrated neighborhoods. The murder had occurred during Washington's evening jog through Palmer Park, a community space that had become symbolic of successful racial integration and economic development that challenged white supremacist narratives about neighborhood demographics and property values. Witness testimony suggested that Washington had been confronted by 3 white males who used racial slurs while demanding he get out of their neighborhood before beating him to death with baseball bats and leaving his body in the park's community garden. Physical evidence included tire tracks from vehicles associated with known white supremacist organizations, DNA evidence linking suspects to the crime scene, and cell phone data placing identified extremists in the area during the estimated time of murder. Detective Paul Brennan had been assigned as lead investigator, despite his documented history of dismissing hate crime allegations and maintaining social connections with individuals affiliated with white supremacist organizations in Riverside and surrounding counties. Brennan's approach to the Washington investigation had immediately raised concerns among community advocates and federal monitoring systems that tracked local law enforcement response to racially motivated violence and institutional bias in criminal justice proceedings. Within 24 hours of Washington's murder, Brennan had characterized the crime as gang violence, despite Washington's complete lack of criminal history, gang affiliations, or involvement with illegal activities that would suggest such motivation. His investigation had systematically ignored physical evidence pointing to white supremacist involvement, while pursuing theories about black-on-black violence that contradicted witness testimony, forensic evidence, and Washington's personal background and community relationships. Community members, led by Reverend William Jackson and the Washington family, had immediately requested federal involvement after observing Brennan's obvious bias and potential corruption in handling evidence and witness interviews. Detective Brennan is protecting the real killers while trying to blame Marcus's murder on gang violence that doesn't exist. Gloria Washington, Marcus's mother, had told federal civil rights advocates, "We need FBI investigation because local police are covering up a lynching." FBI civil rights monitoring systems had been tracking Riverside Police Department's handling of hate crimes for 18 months, noting statistical patterns that suggested systematic under-prosecution of racially motivated violence and over-classification of hate crimes as routine criminal activity. Assistant Director Jennifer Mason had been coordinating federal civil rights enforcement in mid-sized cities where local political dynamics often prevented appropriate prosecution of hate crimes that threatened community safety and constitutional protections. Riverside PD shows concerning patterns of misclassifying hate crimes as routine violence while failing to investigate white supremacist activity that federal intelligence has documented. Mason had reported to Director Hayes during weekly civil rights briefings. The federal monitoring had identified Brennan specifically as detective, whose case clearance rates showed significant disparities based on victim race and suspect demographics, suggesting bias-based rather than evidence-based investigation methods. Special Agent Michael Torres had been conducting surveillance of white supremacist organizations in Riverside area as part of domestic terrorism prevention efforts that tracked extremist groups planning violence against minority communities and democratic institutions. "We have documented intelligence about white supremacist groups planning escalated violence against black professionals and community leaders." Torres had briefed federal task force coordination. The Washington murder fits established patterns of targeted assassination designed to intimidate successful minorities. Federal intelligence had identified 3 specific suspects with documented ties to white supremacist organizations, previous histories of racially motivated violence, and technical capabilities for coordinated hate crime operations that threatened multiple communities. Hayes's decision to personally oversee the federal civil rights investigation had been motivated by recognition that local law enforcement corruption required direct federal intervention rather than collaborative assistance that might be compromised by institutional bias and political protection. Her cover as federal liaison for routine civil rights compliance had been designed to allow discreet observation of local investigation methods while gathering evidence of systematic civil rights violations and obstruction of justice that would support federal prosecution. What Hayes hadn't anticipated was that Detective Brennan's corruption would be so blatant and systematic that maintaining cover would become impossible while protecting community safety and ensuring constitutional enforcement that local authorities were actively undermining. The federal civil rights investigation was about to transform from monitoring operation to direct intervention, requiring comprehensive federal prosecution of law enforcement corruption and systematic civil rights violations that threatened both individual justice and community safety in cities where institutional racism enabled rather than prevented hate crime violence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Director Victoria Hayes entered Riverside Police Department at 9:30 a.m., maintaining her cover as FBI Federal Liaison Victoria Hayes, while conducting what Detective Brennan and local authorities believed was routine civil rights compliance review, rather than targeted investigation into systematic cover-up of racially motivated murder. The police station's atmosphere reflected institutional defensiveness about federal oversight, with personnel displaying polite cooperation that masked obvious resistance to outside scrutiny of local investigation methods and case clearance procedures. Hayes's trained observation immediately identified concerning patterns in case file organization, evidence handling, and personnel interactions that suggested systematic problems with constitutional compliance and professional investigation standards. Detective Brennan approached Hayes with confident authority that reflected his assumption that federal oversight would be ceremonial rather than substantive review of his investigation methods and evidence collection procedures. "Ms. Hayes, I understand you're here about the Washington case," Brennan began, his tone conveying professional courtesy while maintaining territorial control over local investigation. "I want to assure you that Riverside PD follows all appropriate procedures for investigating criminal violence, regardless of victim demographics." His prepared statement revealed experience with federal inquiries while suggesting defensive concern about outside scrutiny rather than transparent cooperation with legitimate civil rights oversight. Hayes responded with careful professionalism designed to maintain cover while gathering information about Brennan's investigation approach. "Detective Brennan, I'm conducting routine compliance review to ensure federal civil rights statutes are being properly applied. Could you walk me through your investigation methodology and evidence assessment?" Her request for specific information was legally appropriate and procedurally standard, but Brennan's reaction suggested defensive hostility about federal evaluation of his case management and investigative conclusions. "Ms. Hayes, while I appreciate federal interest in civil rights compliance, the Washington case is straightforward criminal violence that doesn't require federal intervention," Brennan replied dismissively. "Local investigators understand community dynamics that federal personnel might not fully appreciate." The deflection revealed institutional arrogance about federal oversight while suggesting predetermined conclusions that contradicted evidence-based investigation methodology. Hayes maintained professional demeanor while internally cataloging red flags that confirmed federal intelligence about systematic civil rights violations. "Detective Brennan, could I review the physical evidence and witness statements to understand how you determined this wasn't racially motivated violence?" Her request for evidence review was constitutionally appropriate and procedurally necessary, but Brennan's response revealed obvious obstruction of legitimate federal oversight authority. "Ms. Hayes, ongoing investigations require evidence confidentiality to protect prosecutorial integrity," Brennan stated, using legal language to justify information restrictions. "Federal liaison review doesn't include access to active case materials that might compromise local prosecution efforts." The refusal to provide basic case information violated federal cooperation requirements while suggesting systematic obstruction designed to prevent federal evaluation of investigation quality and constitutional compliance. Hayes recognized that Brennan's obstruction exceeded normal local autonomy concerns and indicated active cover-up, requiring immediate federal intervention rather than patient compliance review. Captain Eddie Morrison joined the conversation with additional administrative barriers. Ms. Hayes, if you need specific case information for federal compliance review, we can arrange appropriate briefings through departmental legal counsel and administrative channels. His bureaucratic delays were designed to prevent federal access to evidence while providing legal cover for obstruction of civil rights investigation. Hayes escalated her inquiry based on obvious stonewalling. Captain Morrison, Federal Civil Rights Review requires immediate access to case materials when potential violations are indicated. Constitutional compliance isn't optional or subject to local administrative preferences. Her assertion of federal authority should have triggered cooperation protocols. But Morrison's response revealed institutional resistance to constitutional oversight. Ms. Hayes, we respect federal authority while maintaining local investigative autonomy, Morrison replied defensively. Civil rights compliance doesn't require federal micromanagement of routine criminal investigations that follow established procedures. The characterization of hate crime investigation as routine, while claiming established procedures that obviously violated constitutional requirements, confirmed systematic institutional problems. Reverend Jackson arrived at the police station, with community delegation demanding federal intervention after observing local law enforcement's obvious cover-up and witness intimidation that prevented legitimate investigation of racially motivated murder. Detective Brennan, the community knows this was a hate crime, and we know you're protecting the real killers, Jackson stated with moral authority backed by community support. We're requesting federal prosecution because local police have demonstrated corruption and bias. His public challenge to Brennan's investigation exposed community awareness of cover-up while creating political pressure for federal accountability. Brennan's response to community advocacy revealed institutional hostility. Reverend Jackson, criminal investigations are conducted by trained professionals based on evidence rather than community speculation and political pressure. Federal liaison doesn't change local authority over criminal prosecution. The dismissive treatment of legitimate community concerns while claiming professional expertise that obviously violated constitutional requirements demonstrated exactly the kind of institutional racism that federal civil rights enforcement was designed to address. Hayes observed Brennan's interaction with community leaders while recognizing that maintaining cover was becoming impossible as systematic civil rights violations escalated beyond administrative non-compliance to active obstruction of federal investigation. Gloria Washington, Marcus's mother, approached Hayes directly. Ms. Hayes, are you really here to ensure justice for my son, or are you just going through federal motions while they cover up his lynching? Her direct challenge forced Hayes to choose between maintaining operational security and protecting community members from ongoing institutional abuse that threaten both individual justice and broader civil rights compliance. As Brennan continued obstructing federal oversight while intimidating community witnesses, Hayes understood that revealing federal authority was necessary to prevent further cover-up while ensuring constitutional enforcement that local corruption was actively undermining. The confrontation between Director Hayes and Detective Brennan intensified as community pressure mounted and federal evidence requirements created unavoidable conflicts between Brennan's cover-up efforts and Hayes's constitutional investigation objectives. Detective Brennan, I need immediate access to all physical evidence, witness statements, and investigative reports related to Marcus Washington's murder, Hayes stated with increasing federal authority while maintaining her liaison cover. Civil rights compliance requires comprehensive case review when community allegations suggest hate crime, misclassification, Brennan's response revealed escalating defensiveness about federal scrutiny. Ms. Hayes, you're exceeding federal liaison authority by demanding access to confidential case materials. Local investigation autonomy prevents federal interference, with ongoing criminal prosecution that follows established departmental procedures. His continued obstruction, while claiming jurisdictional protection, suggested systematic cover-up that required immediate federal intervention rather than administrative cooperation through normal channels. Captain Morrison attempted to provide institutional support for Brennan's obstruction. Ms. Hayes, if federal review requires specific case information, we can schedule appropriate briefings through legal counsel after completing internal administrative coordination and evidence security protocols. The bureaucratic delays were designed to prevent federal access while providing time for evidence manipulation and witness intimidation that would eliminate federal prosecution capabilities. Hayes recognized that normal cooperation protocols were being systematically undermined. Captain Morrison, federal civil rights investigation takes precedence over local administrative convenience when constitutional violations are indicated. Delays in evidence access constitute obstruction of federal authority. Her assertion of constitutional supremacy should have triggered immediate compliance, but Morrison's response revealed institutional commitment to protecting cover-up rather than ensuring federal cooperation. Ms. Hayes, we respect federal oversight while maintaining local prosecutorial integrity, Morrison replied, with obvious legal preparation. Premature federal intervention could compromise ongoing local investigation that serves community safety and justice objectives. The claim that obstruction served community safety while federal intervention threatened justice objectives revealed institutional inversion of constitutional priorities and federal cooperation requirements. Reverend Jackson escalated community pressure by presenting federal investigators with documented evidence of witness intimidation and evidence suppression. Director Hayes, Detective Brennan has been threatening community witnesses while hiding physical evidence that proves Marcus was killed by white supremacists. His use of Director Hayes, rather than Ms. Hayes, suggested community awareness of her actual federal authority, despite official cover identity maintained for operational security. Brennan's reaction to community evidence revealed panic about exposure. Reverend Jackson, community speculation about federal authority doesn't change local investigation procedures. Witness protection and evidence security require professional law enforcement rather than community activism. His defensive response to community knowledge while attempting to discredit witness testimony confirmed systematic cover-up that violated both federal cooperation requirements and constitutional investigation standards. Attorney Jerome Davis arrived with legal documentation of civil rights violations and formal federal complaint. Detective Brennan, the Washington family is filing federal civil rights lawsuit alleging systematic cover-up of racially motivated murder. Federal investigation is mandatory when local authorities demonstrate obvious bias and corruption. The formal legal challenge triggered federal jurisdiction requirements that Brennan could no longer obstruct through administrative delays or jurisdictional claims. Brennan attempted to discredit federal intervention. Attorney Davis, civil rights lawyers don't understand criminal investigation procedures or evidence requirements. Federal lawsuits represent political activism rather than legitimate legal challenges to professional law enforcement. His dismissal of constitutional expertise while claiming professional authority that obviously violated federal standards demonstrated exactly the kind of institutional arrogance that federal oversight was designed to address and prosecute. Special Agent Torres arrived with federal surveillance evidence documenting white supremacist involvement in Washington's murder. Detective Brennan, Federal intelligence shows documented coordination between known extremists and the Washington murder. Your investigation has systematically ignored evidence that federal agencies have been monitoring. The federal intelligence confirmation eliminated any possibility of characterizing the murder as routine criminal violence while exposing Brennan's cover-up as active protection of domestic terrorists. Brennan's response to federal evidence revealed desperate obstruction. Agent Torres, federal intelligence doesn't override local investigation authority. Outside surveillance might not understand community dynamics that affect criminal prosecution and evidence evaluation. His continued obstruction, despite federal evidence confirmation, demonstrated criminal conspiracy rather than investigative disagreement about case classification or evidence interpretation. Gloria Washington confronted Brennan directly about his cover-up. "Detective Brennan, you know who killed my son, and you're protecting them because you share their racist beliefs. Federal agents need to arrest you for covering up Marcus's lynching." Her direct accusation of criminal conspiracy and racial motivation exposed community understanding of systematic corruption while demanding federal accountability for constitutional violations. Brennan's response to victim-family confrontation revealed institutional hostility. "Mrs. Washington, grief doesn't qualify families to make accusations about professional criminal investigation. Federal oversight doesn't change local authority over evidence evaluation and case prosecution." His dismissive treatment of victim family, while claiming professional authority that obviously served cover-up rather than investigation, confirmed systematic institutional racism and criminal conspiracy. As federal evidence mounted, while community pressure intensified, Hayes understood that maintaining cover was impossible, while systematic constitutional violations required immediate federal intervention to prevent further obstruction and witness intimidation. Detective Brennan's cover-up had escalated beyond administrative non-compliance to criminal conspiracy that threatened both individual justice and broader civil rights compliance in communities where institutional racism enabled rather than prevented hate crime violence. The federal investigation was about to transform from discreet monitoring to direct intervention, requiring comprehensive prosecution of law enforcement corruption that protected domestic terrorism while violating constitutional rights of victims and community members seeking justice. While Detective Brennan escalated his cover-up efforts at Riverside Police Department, comprehensive federal investigation systems were rapidly converging evidence that would expose systematic institutional racism and criminal conspiracy, requiring the largest civil rights prosecution in regional history. FBI Assistant Director Jennifer Mason was coordinating multi-agency federal response based on intelligence confirming that Brennan's cover-up was protecting identified domestic terrorists whose hate crime violence threatened multiple communities throughout the region. Detective Brennan is actively obstructing federal civil rights investigation while protecting documented white supremacists who murdered Marcus Washington, Mason reported to FBI headquarters via secure communication. Local institutional corruption requires comprehensive federal intervention rather than cooperation through compromised local channels. The federal intelligence had identified specific perpetrators with documented histories of racially motivated violence, while confirming that local law enforcement corruption was enabling rather than investigating domestic terrorism that threatened community safety and constitutional protections. Special Agent Torres was analyzing communication intercepts and surveillance data that confirmed coordination between white supremacist organizations and sympathetic law enforcement personnel who provided protection from prosecution in exchange for information about federal civil rights monitoring. Brennan has been providing advance warning to extremist organizations about federal surveillance, while receiving financial payments for protecting hate crime perpetrators from prosecution, Torres reported to Federal Task Force Coordination. Local corruption serves domestic terrorism rather than community safety. The criminal conspiracy involved not only cover-up of specific hate crimes, but systematic protection of domestic terrorist networks that threatened democratic institutions and minority communities throughout multiple jurisdictions. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division was reviewing federal prosecution options under domestic terrorism, civil rights conspiracy, and racketeering statutes that would ensure maximum accountability for institutional racism that enabled systematic violence against protected communities. Brennan's cover-up represents systematic civil rights violations that affect not only the Washington family, but broader community safety when law enforcement protects rather than prosecutes domestic terrorism. AUSA Patricia Williams informed federal coordination teams. Federal prosecutors were preparing comprehensive charges that would address both individual criminal conspiracy and institutional racism that created systematic threats to civil rights compliance and community safety. U.S. Marshal Daniel Rodriguez was coordinating federal arrest protocols while ensuring witness protection for community members whose testimony would be crucial for prosecuting systematic institutional corruption and domestic terrorism conspiracy. We're implementing comprehensive witness protection for community members who have documented Brennan's corruption and extremist organization coordination, Rodriguez reported to Federal Task Force leadership. Federal safety measures will prevent retaliation while ensuring testimony needed for prosecution. Meanwhile, investigative reporter Sarah Mitchell had been documenting patterns of hate crime cover-ups and law enforcement corruption that suggested systematic institutional problems requiring federal intervention and public accountability. Riverside Police Department appears in multiple databases for civil rights violations and hate crime misclassification, Mitchell reported to her news organization. Detective Brennan's corruption represents systematic institutional racism that enables domestic terrorism while violating community safety. Her journalism was preparing public accountability measures that would complement federal prosecution while ensuring community awareness of institutional problems requiring comprehensive reform rather than individual punishment. Congressional Representative David Kim, who served on House Judiciary Committee, had been reviewing federal oversight of local law enforcement civil rights compliance and institutional accountability mechanisms. Local law enforcement corruption that protects domestic terrorism threatens both individual constitutional rights and broader community safety, Kim stated during congressional briefing. Federal intervention represents necessary constitutional enforcement rather than jurisdictional overreach. Community advocacy organizations were coordinating legal assistance and victim support while documenting systematic institutional racism that affected multiple families and communities throughout the region. Brennan's corruption represents systematic institutional violence that terrorizes minority communities while protecting white supremacist organizations, Attorney Angela Davis told Civil Rights Coordination meetings. Federal prosecution must address institutional patterns rather than individual criminal behavior. The civil rights framework elevated individual hate crime cover-up to systematic institutional analysis that examined structural racism and federal accountability requirements for constitutional compliance. Reverend Jackson was coordinating community documentation while ensuring that federal investigation addressed broader institutional racism rather than focusing exclusively on individual criminal prosecution that might ignore systematic problems. Our community needs federal accountability that reforms institutional racism rather than just punishing individual corruption, Jackson told federal investigators. Brennan's cover-up represents systematic law enforcement bias that enables domestic terrorism while violating constitutional protections. Federal intelligence agencies were analyzing domestic terrorism networks while confirming that law enforcement corruption provided systematic protection for extremist organizations, planning additional violence against minority communities and democratic institutions. White supremacist organizations rely on law enforcement corruption for operational security and protection from federal prosecution, FBI Domestic Terrorism Analysis reported. Brennan's conspiracy enables systematic domestic terrorism that threatens national security and constitutional compliance. The domestic terrorism analysis elevated hate crime cover-up to national security concern, requiring comprehensive federal response that addressed both individual criminal conspiracy and systematic institutional enablement of extremist violence. Inspector Thomas Reed was conducting federal oversight of civil rights compliance in local law enforcement, while documenting institutional patterns that enabled rather than prevented hate crime violence and domestic terrorism. Local law enforcement. Corruption creates systematic civil rights violations affecting entire communities, Reed reported to Federal Oversight Coordination. Institutional accountability requires comprehensive reform rather than individual disciplinary action. As federal evidence accumulated while community pressure intensified, multiple agencies recognized that Brennan's cover-up represented systematic, institutional corruption requiring comprehensive federal prosecution that would address both individual criminal conspiracy and broader civil rights compliance in communities where institutional racism enabled domestic terrorism. The detectives' protection of hate crime perpetrators had exposed systematic institutional problems that threatened both individual justice and broader community safety when law enforcement authorities served domestic terrorism rather than constitutional protection of minority communities and democratic institutions. Director Victoria Hayes stood in the Riverside Police Department conference room as Detective Brennan's obstruction reached the threshold requiring immediate revelation of federal authority to protect both ongoing investigation integrity and community safety while federal response teams prepared coordinated intervention. Brennan's systematic cover-up had escalated beyond routine local autonomy to criminal conspiracy that violated federal cooperation requirements while threatening comprehensive civil rights investigation that served national security interests and constitutional compliance. Detective Brennan, your obstruction of federal civil rights investigation has exceeded administrative non-compliance and now constitutes criminal conspiracy, Hayes stated, her tone beginning to carry federal authority that suggested law enforcement background beyond routine federal liaison duties. Brennan's response revealed increasing desperation about federal scrutiny. Ms. Hayes, federal liaison review doesn't include authority to make criminal accusations against local law enforcement. Civil rights compliance doesn't override local prosecutorial autonomy and investigation procedures. His continued obstruction despite federal evidence and community pressure demonstrated criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate jurisdictional disagreement about case classification or federal cooperation requirements. Hayes activated discrete federal emergency protocols that would trigger immediate comprehensive response while continuing to document Brennan's civil rights violations and criminal obstruction for federal prosecution evidence. Assistant Director Mason received priority federal alert and authorized immediate intervention. Director Hayes' situation requires comprehensive federal response. Brennan's obstruction threatens both investigation integrity and community safety. Full federal authority for institutional accountability and witness protection. Federal coordination teams positioned throughout Riverside received authorization for intervention designed to protect civil rights investigation while ensuring systematic corruption faced comprehensive federal prosecution rather than local administrative protection. Captain Morrison attempted to provide institutional cover for Brennan's obvious criminal behavior. Ms. Hayes, if Detective Brennan's investigation methods appear problematic, that reflects departmental training emphasis rather than individual misconduct. Local procedures sometimes require federal interpretation for proper compliance understanding. Hayes's response revealed increasing federal authority. Captain Morrison, Detective Brennan has systematically obstructed federal civil rights investigation while protecting identified domestic terrorists from prosecution. His behavior constitutes federal crimes, regardless of departmental training or local institutional protection. The direct assertion of criminal charges while referencing domestic terrorism made clear that federal jurisdiction encompassed systematic civil rights violations and national security threats that exceeded local authority and administrative discretion. Special Agent Torres arrived with federal arrest warrants and comprehensive evidence of criminal conspiracy. Detective Brennan, federal investigation has documented your coordination with white supremacist organizations while systematically covering up hate crime evidence. Federal prosecution is authorized under domestic terrorism and civil rights conspiracy statutes. The federal intervention with arrest authority demonstrated that Brennan's cover-up had triggered comprehensive federal response that local political protection couldn't prevent or administrative procedures couldn't delay. Brennan attempted final obstruction. Agent Torres, federal accusations don't override local investigation authority. Civil rights lawyers and community activists don't understand legitimate law enforcement procedures that federal agencies might misinterpret as constitutional violations. AUSA Williams provided federal legal framework that eliminated Brennan's deflection attempts. Detective Brennan, systematic obstruction of federal civil rights investigation while protecting domestic terrorists constitutes federal crimes under multiple statutes. Local authority doesn't include protection of constitutional violations or domestic terrorism. The Federal Prosecution Authority made clear that civil rights violations and domestic terrorism conspiracy exceeded local jurisdiction while triggering mandatory federal accountability regardless of institutional protection or administrative preference. Federal Marshal Rodriguez coordinated arrest protocols while ensuring community witness protection. Detective Brennan, you are subject to federal arrest for civil rights conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact to domestic terrorism. Federal authority supersedes local institutional protection. The Federal Arrest Authority demonstrated comprehensive federal response that would ensure both individual accountability and institutional reform, addressing systematic corruption that enabled domestic terrorism. Reverend Jackson provided community testimony that supported federal intervention. Director Hayes, our community documented Brennan's systematic corruption and cover-up that protected Marcus Washington's killers. Federal accountability represents constitutional enforcement rather than jurisdictional overreach. His reference to Director Hayes rather than Ms. Hayes suggested community recognition of actual federal authority despite official cover that had been maintained for operational security. Gloria Washington confronted Brennan with victim family. Authority. Detective Brennan, you covered up my son's lynching to protect your white supremacist friends. Federal prosecution represents justice that local corruption prevented. Her direct accusation of criminal conspiracy while demanding federal accountability demonstrated community understanding that civil rights violations required federal intervention rather than local administrative resolution. As federal evidence mounted while arrest authority was confirmed, Hayes understood that revealing federal authority was necessary to prevent further obstruction while ensuring constitutional enforcement that systematic corruption had been undermining. "Detective Brennan," Hayes announced with full federal authority, "I am Director Victoria Hayes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your systematic cover-up of hate crime evidence while protecting domestic terrorists has triggered comprehensive federal civil rights prosecution under my personal supervision. The revelation of actual federal authority eliminated any possibility of continued obstruction, while demonstrating that community civil rights violations had attracted the highest levels of federal attention and accountability." Brennan's shock at federal authority revelation was evident as he recognized that his cover-up had been observed by FBI director, whose institutional authority would ensure comprehensive prosecution rather than local administrative protection. Federal intervention had demonstrated that civil rights violations and domestic terrorism conspiracy triggered immediate federal accountability when systematic institutional corruption threatened both individual justice and broader community safety through law enforcement protection of extremist violence. The detective's protection of hate crime perpetrators had exposed him to federal prosecution under the direct authority of FBI director, whose commitment to civil rights enforcement exceeded local political considerations and institutional convenience. The Riverside Police Department conference room became the epicenter of a power reversal that would expose systematic institutional racism while demonstrating how quickly local political protection could crumble when civil rights violations attracted direct federal intervention at the highest levels. "Detective Paul Brennan," Director Hayes announced, her voice now carrying unmistakable federal law enforcement authority throughout the stunned police station. "I am Director Victoria Hayes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the past 72 hours, you have systematically obstructed a federal civil rights investigation while covering up domestic terrorism that resulted in the racially motivated murder of Marcus Washington." Brennan stood paralyzed as the full implications of his actions became clear. The woman he had dismissed as routine federal liaison was actually the FBI director, whose authority would ensure criminal prosecution rather than administrative protection. "Director Hayes, I had no way of knowing your actual federal authority," Brennan stammered, his institutional confidence dissolving as he recognized that his obstruction had been directed against someone whose jurisdiction far exceeded local political protection. "If I had known you were FBI director, I would never have treated federal civil rights investigation as routine administrative oversight." Hayes's response eliminated any possibility of hiding behind ignorance about federal authority. "Detective Brennan, my actual identity is irrelevant to the fact that you systematically violated federal civil rights statutes while protecting domestic terrorists from prosecution. Your behavior would have been equally criminal if directed against any federal civil rights investigation." The distinction between failing to recognize FBI director and systematically violating constitutional protections made Brennan's actions indefensible under any professional or legal standard. Assistant Director Mason stepped forward with formal federal charges. "Paul Brennan, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of federal justice, accessory after the fact to murder, and coordination with domestic terrorist organizations. Your systematic cover-up constitutes federal crimes under multiple statutes." Captain Morrison, realizing that federal intervention had documented institutional corruption, attempted to distance local administration from Brennan's individual criminal behavior. "Director Hayes, I want to clarify that Riverside Police Department policy prohibits civil rights violations and requires cooperation with federal investigations. Detective Brennan's obstruction does not represent departmental standards or training protocols." Special Agent Torres's response revealed the scope of federal evidence. Captain Morrison, federal surveillance shows systematic institutional protection of Brennan's corruption through administrative cover and evidence suppression. Your department enabled, rather than prevented, civil rights violations that protected domestic terrorism. The systematic corruption charges made clear that Brennan's individual criminal behavior reflected broader institutional problems requiring comprehensive federal accountability rather than selective individual prosecution. Attorney Davis, who had documented Brennan's obstruction, provided additional evidence to federal investigators. Director Hayes, I recorded Detective Brennan's systematic refusal to investigate hate crime evidence while threatening community witnesses. His behavior represents institutional pattern rather than individual misconduct. His legal documentation revealed systematic civil rights violations while demonstrating community impact beyond individual case obstruction. Gloria Washington, whose son's murder had been covered up, addressed federal authorities about broader accountability. Director Hayes, Detective Brennan protected my son's killers while intimidating our family and community witnesses. Federal prosecution should address institutional racism that enables domestic terrorism rather than individual criminal behavior. Community perspective provided crucial context about systematic institutional violence that affected not only individual victims but broader civil rights compliance and community safety. Reverend Jackson provided community testimony that confirmed systematic institutional problems. Director Hayes, Brennan's corruption represents years of institutional racism that protected white supremacist violence while intimidating minority communities. Federal accountability must address systematic rather than individual civil rights violations. Federal Marshal Rodriguez announced comprehensive arrests as evidence teams secured documentation of criminal conspiracy. Paul Brennan, Eddie Morrison. Kelly, you are under federal arrest for civil rights conspiracy, domestic terrorism enablement, and obstruction of federal justice. Additional arrests will follow as investigation expands. The systematic arrests demonstrated that federal jurisdiction encompassed entire criminal network rather than individual participants, ensuring comprehensive accountability for institutional racism and domestic terrorism protection. Special Agent Torres provided federal intelligence that confirmed domestic terrorism coordination. Detective Brennan received $127,000 in payments from white supremacist organizations over 2 years, while providing advance warning about federal civil rights monitoring and hate crime investigations. The financial evidence eliminated any possibility of characterizing corruption as procedural disagreement, while confirming systematic criminal conspiracy that served domestic terrorism rather than law enforcement objectives. Brennan made final attempt to minimize criminal liability. Director Hayes, if my investigation methods appear to violate civil rights, that reflects departmental training emphasis rather than intentional domestic terrorism coordination. Local law enforcement sometimes makes decisions that federal oversight might interpret as constitutional violations. Hayes's response was definitive. Detective Brennan, you systematically covered up racially motivated murder while protecting identified domestic terrorists and receiving financial payments for obstruction of federal civil rights investigation. Your behavior constitutes serious federal crimes that professional training neither requires nor justifies. As federal agents completed arrest operations while preserving evidence of systematic institutional corruption, the transformation was complete. The local law enforcement network that had operated through racism and domestic terrorism protection now faced comprehensive federal prosecution under direct FBI director authority. The detective who had dismissed federal civil rights enforcement as routine administrative oversight now faced federal prosecution that would expose systematic institutional racism to accountability that local political protection couldn't prevent and administrative convenience couldn't influence. Hayes understood that exposing Brennan's corruption had revealed systematic institutional problems requiring comprehensive federal intervention rather than individual criminal prosecution, ensuring that civil rights violations and domestic terrorism enablement would face federal accountability that served constitutional compliance rather than local institutional convenience. The morning following Director Hayes's revelation triggered comprehensive federal intervention that transformed systematic institutional racism from protected local practice to federal criminal prosecution, while establishing precedent for civil rights enforcement that would reshape law enforcement accountability nationwide. Within 8 hours of Brennan's arrest, Attorney General Patricia Williams announced formal federal investigation into law enforcement civil rights compliance in mid-sized cities, recognizing that institutional racism and domestic terrorism protection represented broader problems requiring systematic federal accountability. Detective Brennan's protection of hate crime perpetrators while obstructing federal civil rights investigation demonstrates systematic institutional racism that affects not only individual victims but broader community safety when law enforcement enables rather than prevents domestic terrorism, Williams announced during federal press conference. Director Hayes personally addressed institutional accountability during congressional testimony that would establish federal standards for civil rights enforcement and domestic terrorism prevention in local law enforcement operations. Brennan's systematic cover-up represents institutional racism that threatens both individual constitutional rights and broader national security when law enforcement protects domestic terrorist organizations rather than investigating hate crime violence. Hayes told House Judiciary Committee, her testimony elevated individual criminal prosecution to systematic institutional analysis that examined structural racism and federal accountability requirements for constitutional compliance and community safety. Congressional Representative Kim announced legislative oversight during hearings focused on federal civil rights enforcement and domestic terrorism prevention. Law enforcement corruption that protects hate crime perpetrators threatens both individual justice and broader democratic institutions when institutional racism enables domestic terrorism. Federal accountability measures were implemented immediately. Mandatory federal oversight for hate crime investigations, automatic federal prosecution triggered by civil rights violations, enhanced community complaint systems, and federal funding tied to constitutional compliance rather than administrative convenience. Detective Brennan was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for civil rights conspiracy, domestic terrorism enablement, and obstruction of federal justice, the harshest punishment ever imposed for law enforcement hate crime cover-up, establishing precedent that institutional racism carried severe federal consequences. Paul Brennan systematically violated constitutional rights while enabling domestic terrorism that threatened community safety and democratic institutions, federal judge stated during sentencing. Law enforcement corruption that protects hate crime violence demands maximum federal punishment that protects future communities from institutional racism. Captain Morrison faced federal prosecution for enabling corruption and received a 15-year sentence for civil rights conspiracy and administrative protection of domestic terrorism. His conviction demonstrating institutional accountability beyond individual criminal behavior. Riverside Police Department underwent complete federal restructuring under Department of Justice oversight, new leadership, comprehensive constitutional training, community oversight participation, and federal monitoring ensuring civil rights. compliance while maintaining legitimate law enforcement effectiveness. Federal oversight included establishment of victim compensation fund totaling $34 million, distributed among families affected by institutional racism, providing financial support for legal costs, community healing, and educational programs addressing systematic discrimination and hate crime prevention. Gloria Washington was appointed to Federal Civil Rights Oversight Board, ensuring that reform addressed victim family priorities rather than administrative convenience. Federal accountability must serve community healing and institutional reform that prevents future hate crime cover-ups rather than simply punishing individual corruption. Her voice in oversight ensured that federal intervention addressed systematic institutional problems rather than focusing exclusively on individual criminal prosecution. Reverend Jackson coordinated community healing programs addressing trauma caused by institutional racism and law enforcement protection of domestic terrorism. Law enforcement corruption creates institutional trauma affecting entire communities. Federal accountability must include community healing and institutional reform that rebuilds trust in agencies that protect rather than violate civil rights. Community healing required addressing not only individual victimization, but collective trauma caused by systematic institutional betrayal that had made law enforcement a source of fear rather than protection for minority communities. Federal Emergency Management Agency announced community recovery assistance, recognizing that systematic institutional racism constituted community disaster, requiring comprehensive federal support for healing and democratic institution rebuilding. Institutional racism and domestic terrorism protection represent community disasters requiring federal intervention for recovery and constitutional restoration, FEMA coordinator announced. Federal resources will support victim services, institutional reform, and community healing programs. Attorney Davis announced comprehensive civil rights litigation representing affected communities. We're filing federal lawsuits seeking damages for systematic civil rights violations affecting dozens of families over multiple years. Federal compensation will address institutional harm while ensuring comprehensive reform. The civil litigation provided additional accountability beyond criminal prosecution while ensuring that systematic constitutional violations resulted in financial consequences that motivated institutional reform rather than administrative tolerance. Federal Bureau of Investigation announced enhanced domestic terrorism prevention protocols requiring coordinated federal-local investigation of hate crimes and automatic federal prosecution when local authorities demonstrated bias or corruption that threatened civil rights compliance. Domestic terrorism prevention requires constitutional law enforcement that investigates rather than protects extremist violence. FBI Domestic Terrorism Coordinator announced. Federal oversight ensures that law enforcement serves rather than enables domestic terrorist organizations. The systematic reform process concluded with permanent federal monitoring, statistical analysis of law enforcement civil rights compliance, community oversight with federal authority, automatic federal prosecution triggered by institutional racism and congressional oversight, ensuring sustained constitutional compliance. Data analysis 12 months after federal intervention showed remarkable improvements. Hate crime investigations increased by 89%, civil rights violations by law enforcement decreased by 96%, and community trust in federal civil rights enforcement increased dramatically as residents experienced constitutional protection rather than institutional racism. Constitutional compliance enhanced rather than hindered legitimate law enforcement effectiveness, federal oversight reported. Professional hate crime investigation provides better community safety than institutional racism while protecting civil rights that law enforcement is sworn to defend. The accountability process established permanent federal monitoring, ensuring that law enforcement constitutional compliance would be sustained through federal oversight rather than reverting to local administrative tolerance that had enabled systematic civil rights violations and domestic terrorism protection. Over the following 24 months, Riverside had undergone the most comprehensive law enforcement transformation in state history, implementing changes that served as a national model for eliminating institutional racism while enhancing legitimate civil rights protection through constitutional compliance and community partnership. The Federal Civil Rights Compliance Commission, established under Department of Justice authority, was directed by former federal prosecutor Dr. Angela Martinez, whose expertise in civil rights law and institutional reform made her uniquely qualified to rebuild law enforcement systems that had systematically enabled domestic terrorism while violating constitutional protections. "We're not just removing racist personnel," Dr. Martinez explained during mandatory training attended by all 89 Riverside Police Department employees and 340 regional law enforcement officers. "We're building constitutional law enforcement systems that protect community safety through civil rights compliance, rather than institutional racism that enables domestic terrorism." The comprehensive training emphasized constitutional policing, hate crime investigation, and community partnership rather than racial bias, domestic terrorism protection, and systematic civil rights violations that had characterized institutional corruption. Police Chief Robert Stone, appointed through federal oversight process, implemented revolutionary accountability measures throughout law enforcement operations. Every hate crime investigation was now federally monitored, with monthly statistical analysis showing case clearance patterns and constitutional compliance assessment that ensured professional investigation rather than institutional cover-up. Community safety requires constitutional law enforcement that investigates rather than enables hate crime violence, Stone explained to Federal Oversight Board. Professional hate crime investigation based on evidence rather than bias provides more effective community protection while ensuring civil rights compliance. The accountability framework made institutional racism organizationally impossible to sustain, while ensuring that legitimate law enforcement could effectively address genuine threats through constitutional means rather than discriminatory enforcement. Director Hayes worked with Department of Justice experts to develop the Riverside Protocol, comprehensive procedures for identifying and addressing institutional racism in law enforcement before it escalated to systematic civil rights violations requiring federal prosecution. Law enforcement agencies wield significant authority over community safety and must operate through constitutional compliance rather than institutional bias, Hayes explained during congressional testimony about police accountability. When law enforcement enables domestic terrorism, it threatens both individual civil rights and broader democratic institution integrity. Her framework elevated constitutional compliance from administrative requirement to public safety imperative that federal oversight would ensure through systematic monitoring and community accountability. The Community Safety and Civil Rights Commission, established with authority independent of police administration, included hate crime victims, civil rights advocates, constitutional law experts, and federal representatives with power to investigate institutional racism, review law, enforcement practices, and recommend federal prosecution for systematic violations. Gloria Washington, whose son's murder had catalyzed federal intervention, served as victim family representative, ensuring that reform addressed actual community harm rather than administrative convenience or law enforcement preferences. Constitutional. Policing must serve community protection and civil rights compliance rather than institutional convenience or racial bias. Washington told the commission during quarterly reviews. Federal oversight ensures that law enforcement protects rather than violates the constitutional rights that my son died defending. Community control over oversight ensured that reform addressed residents' experiences with institutional racism rather than law enforcement priorities or federal bureaucratic convenience. Federal hate crime investigation protocols were enhanced nationwide through lessons learned from Riverside. Mandatory federal coordination for racially motivated violence, automatic federal prosecution when local authorities demonstrated bias, community witness protection, and federal funding tied to constitutional compliance rather than case clearance statistics. Hate crime investigation requires constitutional law enforcement that serves civil rights protection rather than institutional racism, Federal Hate Crime Coordinator explained during national law enforcement training. Community safety depends on professional investigation that protects rather than enables domestic terrorism. Federal oversight included establishment of Hate Crime Victim Services Fund, totaling $67 million distributed among families affected by institutional racism, providing comprehensive support for legal assistance, community healing, psychological, counseling, and educational programs addressing systematic discrimination. Marcus Washington Scholarship Program received federal funding to support minority students pursuing criminal justice education with emphasis on constitutional compliance and civil rights protection, ensuring that future law enforcement would serve rather than violate community civil rights. Education represents long-term institutional change that prevents rather than responds to civil rights violations, Scholarship Coordinator explained. Professional law enforcement education must emphasize constitutional compliance and community service rather than institutional bias and domestic terrorism tolerance. Reverend Jackson coordinated interfaith community healing programs addressing spiritual and psychological trauma caused by institutional racism and law enforcement protection of domestic terrorism. Law enforcement corruption creates spiritual trauma affecting entire communities. Federal accountability must include community healing that rebuilds trust in institutions that serve rather than violate constitutional principles. Religious community leadership provided crucial perspective about institutional healing that addressed moral and spiritual dimensions of systematic civil rights violations and community recovery. Federal domestic terrorism prevention protocols were enhanced based on Riverside experience, systematic monitoring of extremist organization coordination with law enforcement, automatic federal investigation triggered by institutional racism, community reporting systems for domestic terrorism enablement, and federal prosecution authority for law enforcement corruption. Domestic terrorism prevention requires constitutional law enforcement that investigates rather than protects extremist violence, Federal Domestic Terrorism Coordinator announced. Institutional racism represents national security threat when law enforcement enables rather than prevents domestic terrorist coordination. Data analysis 30 months into reform showed remarkable transformation. Hate crime conviction rates increased by 94%, community trust in law enforcement increased by 91%, and domestic terrorism activity decreased dramatically as federal oversight eliminated institutional protection for extremist organizations. Constitutional compliance enhanced rather than compromised law enforcement effectiveness, federal oversight reported. Professional hate crime investigation provides better community protection than institutional racism while serving civil rights that strengthen rather than threaten democratic institutions. 3 years after Detective Brennan's arrest by Director Hayes, Riverside had become the national model for constitutional law enforcement, demonstrating how comprehensive federal intervention could eliminate institutional racism while strengthening legitimate civil rights protection through professional policing and community partnership. The transformation was evident throughout the city. Police operations that had once protected domestic terrorism now featured professional hate crime investigation based on constitutional compliance and community safety. The atmosphere of institutional racism and civil rights violations had been replaced by transparent accountability, effective crime prevention, and genuine community trust in law enforcement that served rather than violated constitutional principles. Director Hayes returned to Riverside for the dedication of the Marcus Washington Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Center, a permanent reminder of how federal accountability could transform institutional racism into constitutional compliance, while honoring individual victims whose deaths had catalyzed systematic reform. This center represents what constitutional law enforcement looks like when civil rights protection and community safety are integrated into every aspect of police operations, Director Hayes announced during the dedication ceremony attended by 600 community members, federal officials, and law enforcement professionals. The comprehensive training facility provided evidence-based policing education that emphasized constitutional compliance while maintaining effective community protection through professional rather than discriminatory enforcement methods. When law enforcement operates constitutionally, every community safety indicator improves, Hayes explained to visiting police officials from other jurisdictions. Crime clearance rates increase because communities cooperate with rather than fear police. Civil rights violations decrease through professional accountability, and democratic institutions strengthen rather than deteriorate through institutional racism. Police Chief Stone, whose federal oversight leadership had been crucial for implementing constitutional reform, displayed statistical evidence of transformation that demonstrated comprehensive improvement in both civil rights compliance and legitimate law enforcement effectiveness. Constitutional compliance enhanced every aspect of police operations, Stone told Federal Oversight Delegation. Community cooperation increased by 89%. Hate crime conviction rates improved through professional investigation, and police legitimacy strengthened as officers earned rather than demanded public respect through constitutional service. His leadership of institutional transformation proved that civil rights protection served rather than hindered police effectiveness when implemented through comprehensive federal oversight and community accountability. Gloria Washington, whose son's murder had exposed institutional racism requiring federal intervention, now directed the Federal Victim Rights and Law Enforcement Accountability Project, ensuring that systematic civil rights violations would face immediate federal prosecution rather than local. Administrative tolerance. Marcus's death taught us that documenting institutional racism represents moral obligation rather than optional advocacy. Washington explained to victim families studying federal civil rights protection. Federal accountability ensures that law enforcement serves rather than violates the constitutional rights that protect rather than threaten democratic communities. Her transformation from grieving mother to federal advocate demonstrated how personal tragedy could be channeled into systematic constitutional protection and institutional accountability. The Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Division had expanded Riverside's protocols to monitor law enforcement constitutional compliance in 127 cities, using statistical analysis and community feedback to identify institutional racism before it enabled domestic terrorism or systematic civil rights violations. Detective Brennan's criminal conspiracy had been documented in federal law enforcement training as example of how institutional racism corrupted individual character, while enabling domestic terrorism that threatened both community safety and democratic institution integrity. His conviction and imprisonment had established precedent that law enforcement Civil rights violations carried serious federal consequences. Regardless of local political protection or administrative convenience, Attorney Davis had established the National Law Enforcement Civil Rights Accountability Project, providing legal representation for communities facing institutional racism while ensuring systematic federal intervention rather than individual case resolution that ignored broader constitutional compliance. Civil rights violations by law enforcement represent federal crimes that threaten both individual constitutional protection and broader democratic legitimacy. Davis explained during national civil rights conferences, comprehensive federal accountability ensures that police authority serves rather than violates constitutional principles. Federal hate crime investigation protocols developed through Riverside experience had eliminated systematic cover-ups while enhancing legitimate community protection. Professional investigation standards, automatic federal prosecution for bias-motivated violence, community witness protection, and institutional accountability for constitutional compliance. Special Agent Torres, promoted to direct federal domestic terrorism prevention, had used Riverside experience to develop systematic monitoring that prevented rather than responded to law enforcement coordination with extremist organizations. Institutional racism represents national security threat when law enforcement protects rather than investigates domestic terrorism. Torres told federal security conferences, constitutional compliance serves both civil rights protection and national security objectives that strengthen democratic institutions. As Hayes toured the Marcus Washington Center that honored individual victim while celebrating systematic reform, she reflected on how exposing institutional racism had catalyzed comprehensive federal accountability protecting millions of citizens while strengthening rather than weakening legitimate law enforcement. The police station where Brennan had covered up hate crime violence now represented national leadership in constitutional compliance and civil rights protection that served rather than violated community safety and democratic values. Most importantly, Riverside demonstrated that constitutional law enforcement enhanced rather than compromised police effectiveness, that civil rights protection strengthened rather than weakened community safety, and that systematic reform created safer communities rather than operational limitations. The FBI director, who had been dismissed as routine federal liaison, now left behind institutions where constitutional protection was guaranteed through federal oversight, where community safety was achieved through civil rights compliance, and where law enforcement served rather than violated the constitutional principles that defined American democracy. That transformation from institutional racism to constitutional compliance, from domestic terrorism protection to civil rights enforcement, from systematic corruption to federal accountability, represented the kind of change that made law enforcement serve its constitutional purpose of protecting rather than violating the rights of citizens it was sworn to defend. The federal investigation that began with hate crime cover-up had evolved into comprehensive constitutional reform that demonstrated how individual courage could trigger institutional transformation when backed by federal commitment to civil rights, principles and democratic accountability that protected rather than threatened constitutional government. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.